There's something I never told anyone, not even my family.
I still remember the exact moment I realized we were going to die. It was not during an explosion. It was not during a charge. It was during a silence. My name is Arthur Bennett, and what I am about to tell you is the one memory I tried to forget for most of my life. If you stay with me, I will tell you everything, not today alone, but in the days to come. These stories are the only way I know to keep the men I served with alive, even if only in memory. People sometimes ask me why I still wear this uniform. I do not wear it for honor. I do not wear it for medals. I wear it because every time I hear the old songs we used to play in camp, the slow ones, the ones sung quietly at night, I'm no longer here in this room. I am back there. And sometimes I miss them so much that silence becomes unbearable. So I put on this uniform, and I remember. It was the winter of 1944. The ground was frozen so hard that digging a trench felt like trying to carve stone. The wind carried the smell of smoke and damp earth, and every breath burned in your chest. We had been holding that position for 3 days. 3 days of waiting. Waiting is the worst part of war, not the fighting, not the noise, the waiting. Because while you wait, your mind begins to imagine things. You think about home, about food, about people you have not seen in years, about things so small and ordinary that they suddenly feel more precious than anything else in the world. I remember standing beside a young lieutenant named Harris. He was staring at the horizon, his gloves in his hands, rubbing them slowly as if trying to warm them. He said very quietly, "Sir, do you ever think about what happens if we don't make it back?" I did not answer him right away because the truth is, I thought about that every day. But a general does not say that out loud. So I told him we will make it back, and for a moment I believed it. That afternoon the sky turned dark long before sunset. Heavy clouds rolled in, low and gray, pressing down on the land like a weight. And then we heard it, a sound so distant that at first it did not even seem real, a low rumble, like thunder far away. But it was not thunder, it was artillery. At first the men froze, no one spoke. We just listened as the sound grew louder and closer and louder still. Then the first shell hit, not near us, not yet, but close enough that we felt the ground tremble beneath our boots. And in that moment, something changed in every man there. You could see it in their eyes, the realization that this was not training, not a drill, not something that would pass quietly. This was war, and it had finally found us. The bombardment began slowly, a shell every few minutes, then every minute, then so fast that the air itself seemed to shake. Dirt rained down into the trenches. The sound was unbearable. Metal tearing through the sky, explosions hammering the earth, men shouting orders that were swallowed by the noise. I remember gripping the edge of the trench, my knuckles white, feeling the shock waves hit my chest like blows, and then, suddenly, it stopped, just like that. Silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the kind that makes your ears ring, the kind that feels wrong. I climbed out of the trench slowly, scanning the horizon. Smoke drifted across the field, thin and gray, carried by the wind. And that is when I saw it. Where there had been a line of trees an hour before, there was nothing, just broken ground, black earth, torn roots, and men, or what was left of them. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. In less than 10 minutes, 300 men had disappeared, not retreated, not captured, gone. That was the moment I understood something that stayed with me for the rest of my life. War does not always take people one by one. Sometimes it erases them all at once. That night, no one spoke in our camp, not a single voice. We sat in darkness, listening to the wind, each man alone with his thoughts, each man seeing the same images in his mind. I remember looking up at the sky. The stars were bright, beautiful, peaceful, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could still be beautiful when so much had just been destroyed. Even now, all these years later, when I close my eyes, I still see that empty field, and I still hear that silence. That was the day I stopped believing I was young, and that was only the beginning of what we would face. After that day, something inside all of us changed. You could see it in the way men moved, slower, quieter, as if the weight of what we had witnessed had settled into our bones. No one joked anymore. No one spoke about going home or fishing boats or apple trees or the ordinary lives waiting somewhere far away. War had stopped being an idea. It had become real. That evening the cold came down harder than before. The wind carried the smell of smoke and wet earth, and the sky turned the color of iron. We were ordered to move before nightfall, to shift our position a few miles east where the line was weakening. Moving at night is different from moving in daylight. Every sound feels louder. Every shadow feels alive. The ground seems to reach up and grab at your boots, and the darkness presses against your eyes until you begin to imagine shapes where there are none. We moved in silence, a long column of men walking through fields and broken hedgerows, the only sound the crunch of frost beneath our boots and the faint clink of equipment. I remember the moon that night. It was thin and pale, barely enough to see by, but enough to cast long shadows across the ground. The land looked empty, but it never truly was. Somewhere, unseen, another army was always watching, always listening. After several hours, we reached a small village that had been abandoned weeks earlier. The houses stood empty, doors hanging open, windows shattered. A child's wooden cart lay in the middle of the road, half buried in mud, as if someone had dropped it and never come back. War leaves places like that behind, silent, frozen in time, waiting for people who will never return. We were ordered to rest there until dawn. I found myself sitting on the steps of a stone house, my back against the wall, listening to the wind move through the broken roofs. Somewhere in the darkness, a loose shutter kept knocking softly over and over like a slow, distant heartbeat. I remember closing my eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to rest them. And then I heard footsteps running, fast, uneven. A soldier burst into the square, breathless, his face pale even in the dim light. "They hit the convoy," he said. "Ambush, about 2 miles back." There was no hesitation. Orders were given, and within minutes we were moving again, this time back the way we had come. The night felt colder now, sharper, as if the air itself had turned against us. We found them in a narrow stretch of road bordered by trees. The trucks were still there, one of them burning slowly, flames flickering orange against the darkness. The smell reached us before the sight did. Smoke, fuel, and something else I will not describe. Men were lying everywhere, some calling for help, some silent, some beyond any help at all. War in those moments becomes very simple. There are no speeches, no strategies, no grand plans. There is only one task: help the living. We began carrying the wounded, back and forth, through mud, through darkness, slipping, stumbling, lifting men who were heavier than they should have been because fear and exhaustion make every step harder. I remember carrying one young soldier whose arm was wrapped in a field dressing already soaked through. He kept apologizing. "I'm sorry, sir," he kept saying. "I'm slowing you down." I told him he wasn't slowing anyone down, but he kept saying it over and over as if he believed it was his fault that war had found him. We worked for hours. The cold cut through our coats, through our gloves, into our hands until they were numb and shaking. The moon sank lower and the darkness deepened, and still we carried men, refusing to stop because stopping meant leaving someone behind. At one point I stumbled and nearly fell, my legs trembling from exhaustion. A corporal beside me steadied my shoulder and said quietly, "Just a little farther, sir. Just a little farther." Those words carried us through that night. Near dawn, the last of the wounded had been moved. The fires had burned low, and a gray light began to spread across the sky. And that was when the silence came again. Not the silence of peace, the silence that comes after something terrible, when even the wind seems to stop out of respect for what has happened. I stood there in the road, looking at the empty trucks, the blackened ground, the broken trees, and I felt something I had not felt before. Not fear, not anger, grief, not for one man, not for two, for all of them, for the boys who would never see home again, for the families who would receive letters instead of sons, for the lives that had ended in a place so far from anything familiar that it felt unreal. War teaches you many things, but the hardest lesson is how quietly life can end. We returned to the village as the sun rose, pale and cold, lighting the broken rooftops and empty streets. The men moved slowly now, exhaustion weighing on every step. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. That morning I sat alone in the doorway of that stone house and watched the light creep across the ground. And I realized something that I have never forgotten. The bravest men I ever knew were not the ones who charged forward shouting. They were the ones who kept walking, even when they were tired, even when they were afraid, even when they knew the road ahead might be the last one they ever walked. And that night, we kept walking. But what happened the next day was something none of us were prepared for. The next morning began so quietly that it almost felt unreal. After the night we had lived through, I expected the distant thunder of artillery, the rattle of gunfire, the tension that had become as familiar to us as breathing. But when I stepped outside, there was nothing. No engines, no explosions, no shouting, only the sound of wind moving through broken rooftops and the faint creak of wood somewhere in the distance. For a moment I thought I had gone deaf. I stood there listening, waiting for the world to resume its noise, but it didn't. The silence remained, heavy and strange, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Men began to emerge from the houses where they had slept. They looked around in the same confusion I felt, exchanging quiet glances, unsure what to make of it. One of the radio operators came running across the square, a folded paper in his hand, his face pale but bright with something I had not seen in years. Hope. He stopped in front of me, slightly out of breath, and handed me the message. I read it once, then again. The words did not seem real at first. Ceasefire. Negotiations underway. Hostilities suspended. I lowered the paper slowly and looked at the men around me. Some were watching my face, waiting for an answer I had not yet spoken aloud. "It's over," I said quietly, "at least for now." No one cheered. That is something people do not understand. In the films, soldiers shout and celebrate when the fighting stops. But in real life, the end of war does not feel like victory. It feels like exhaustion. The men sat down where they stood. Some leaned against walls. One man simply lowered himself to the ground and stared at the sky, blinking slowly as if waking from a long dream. For a long time, no one spoke. And then, Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to ring. It was faint at first, carried on the wind from a village miles away, a slow, steady tolling echoing across the fields. One by one, the men lifted their heads and listened. That sound, I will never forget it. Not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the sound of something ending. I walked alone to the edge of the village and looked out across the fields. The morning light was soft, spreading across the land, revealing the scars left by months of fighting, craters, broken trees, abandoned equipment half buried in mud. And yet, in that light, the land looked peaceful, almost as if nothing had ever happened. That is one of the strangest things about war. The world heals faster than the people who lived through it. I stood there for a long time thinking about the men who were not there to see that morning. Harris with his photograph of the little house and the white fence. The corporal who had steadied my shoulder in the darkness. The young soldier who kept apologizing as we carried him through the night. They were gone, and the world kept turning. Later that day, we were told to prepare to move again, not to the front, but away from it, away from the guns, away from the trenches, away from the places that had become our entire world. The men packed quietly. There was no rush now, no urgency, just a slow, careful gathering of belongings, as if no one quite believed it was real. I remember picking up my coat and brushing dried mud from the sleeve. My hands paused for a moment, resting on the fabric. That was the first time I realized I was afraid of something new. I was afraid of going home, because I knew I would never be the same man who had left. Weeks later, when I finally stepped off the transport ship and saw my country again, everything looked unchanged. The streets were busy. Children played in the sunlight. People laughed and argued and hurried along, living their lives as if the world had never been on fire. And I stood there, feeling like a stranger in my own home. War does not end when the guns fall silent. It stays with you, in small ways. In the way loud noises make you turn your head too quickly. In the way certain songs bring back faces you thought you had forgotten. In the way silence sometimes feels heavier than sound. Years passed, decades. The world moved on, cities grew, new wars began and ended. The young became old, and the old became memories. And I became an old man sitting in a quiet room. Sometimes, in the evenings, I take this uniform from the closet and put it on, not because I wish to go back to those days, but because part of me never left them. I sit in this chair and I play those old songs, the slow ones, the ones we used to hear drifting across the camps at night, and I close my eyes, and for a moment, I can see them again, not as they were at the end, but as they were in the beginning. Laughing, talking, believing they had all the time in the world. That is how I choose to remember them. And that is why I tell these stories. Because as long as someone listens, they are not entirely gone.